Hello and welcome to the History of CAD podcast. My name is Rupinder Tara and I will be your host. On this podcast, we will explore the untold stories behind the tools that shape modern engineering and design. Each episode features conversations with the pioneers of computer-aided design, the innovators who built the software, and those who worked alongside them or observed or reviewed their work. We dedicate this podcast to the late David Weisberg, who wrote a 650-page treatise, The Engineering Design Revolution, which we will refer to often. Today, I have the pleasure of talking to Keith Bentley, co-founder and technology visionary behind Bentley Systems, the leading global infrastructure engineering software company. Keith has a bachelor's degree in electrical engineering from the University of Delaware, followed by a master's in electrical engineering from the University of Florida. Despite the electrical engineering education, Keith's career has all been about programming. It began at DuPont, where he developed a low-cost alternative to expensive workstations to access CAD drawings. It inspired him to start Bentley Systems in 1984 alongside his brother Barry. He led a war for independence against Intergraph and led Bentley from its first big hit, MicroStation, to a robust portfolio of products and leadership in infrastructure. We joined Keith as we discuss what he's doing these days.
I'm retired. I do attend my share of meetings from time to time, but I only go to the ones I like. I pick what I want to work on, and I get involved where I think I can help. But I, you know, I tell everybody I don't work for this company anymore.
Do you have a secret back door that you go into to avoid?
I am still a director, so I
Okay.
still have an account and an email and a computer. But yeah, it's fun now. I was really, frankly, not sure what I would expect in retirement, but I'm staying busy, and
Yeah.
it
All
kind
right.
of helps
So
to
have
stay
you,
connected.
I imagine, I'm reading through your an account of Bentley on History of CAD as well as on I'm sure you're familiar with that David Weisberg's
Yeah, David
History of CAD.
Weisberg. Yeah, he did a
Yeah.
nice job.
He probably created one of the best
Yeah,
histories.
he did a pretty thorough job, and I remember sitting down with him uh, more than once um, on that, and well, and other things. He wrote lots
Yeah.
of other
Yeah.
CAD-related
He-
stuff. There's also a book about Bentley Systems. This is a book published by Bentley Systems. It's
I'll,
actually
I'll,
online. Even I saw
I'll
Bentley
have to check
Story.
that out. It's
I think it's called. It's at bentleystory.com or something like that.
it's all probably been said, or do you still feel like there's a need to write your memoirs yet?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I'm hoping that more there will be more to say.
Did you cultivate? You seem like you were far too busy to do anything besides develop software or manage the team, right? Did you ever develop any hobbies that you could go back to?
Well,
Gardening, sailing,
my
anything?
my father was a woodworker. My grandfather was a professional woodworker. That's what we did for a living.
Hey.
And so, my dad had a wood shop in the basement, and
Oh,
so I've taken up woodworking, and I wouldn't say I've been any good at it, but you know what? Nowadays, I have a CNC machine. It takes all the skill out of woodworking, or at least a large percentage of projects I can do on my CNC machine, and
okay.
that's fun.
I've just worked with hand tools, but also I'm an amateur woodworker, and I tell my wife I'm out. I don't make anything spectacular, but I make a lot of sawdust.
Well, that's I mean, most of woodworking is making sawdust. I'm making uh, plaques for my grandchildren. I have 7 small grandchildren, and I'm making them plaques, which I did to using inlays.
Uh-huh.
But inlays are a difficult thing to do manually, but with a CNC machine, it's possible. I wouldn't say it's easy because
Yeah.
I made lots of scrap woods out of what it was intended to be inlays.
CNC. So again, you are departing far, far from your original vocation that you had picked. You were electrical engineer. Yeah,
I was an electrical engineer. I guess I could say I still am an electrical
still
engineer.
am.
I have
You
a
can't give
degree in
that
electrical
up.
engineering.
Uh-huh.
And I tell people, computers didn't really, well, they existed, but there wasn't much. There was no major for computing engineering in the electrical engineering. Now, electrical engineering is mostly about computers and computer hardware, but it was mostly back in those days, computers were rare. So I had to actually go to a physical computer when I went, when I was in school. So I tell everybody I got a degree in electrical engineering, but I never designed anything electrical. All I do ever in my entire career is write software.
Right, software for the AC world, no less. So,
Well, I kind of gravitated to that, but when we began,
uh,
had it just was drafting, and the drafting could have been for a small part. Originally a lot of our software was used for mechanical design. So yes, we eventually determined that infrastructure, what we now call infrastructure, but they used it in the time, it used to be called AEC. Maybe even people still use that term. uh,
yeah,
that was something that we gravitated towards only after trying lots of other things.
right, right. Your first job, was it out of school? You worked for DuPont and you
I
developed
did.
software there
I did.
for reading drawings into.
Yes, for process and instrumentation drawings.
Hmm.
DuPont was a chemical company, and they
Right,
had chemical plants, and they actually wrote in-house some software for designing or for creating P&ID drawings, and that was my first exposure to to CAD.
yeah.
Frankly, at the beginning, I didn't even know. I don't think anybody really called it CAD back then. Maybe they did,
I
but
know. I was going to ask, what do they refer to it as? Drawing
Well, it
or?
was called the name of the system. It was internally developed by DuPont. It was well ahead of its time, I think.
Yeah.
It was called Grid. I don't even remember, interactive design or something like that.
Uh-huh.
And I worked on it for, I don't know, maybe a year and a half, and then DuPont decided that writing software wasn't in their scope, so they decided to replace it with CAD, well, at the time, and that was called CAD, something called from a company called M&S Computing, which you may have heard of.
M&S.
M&S
Uh-huh.
Computing became Intergraph. They renamed themselves Intergraph only after I started working on uh, the programming of converting the data, the system that DuPont wrote internally to the M&S. And then while I was working on it, they renamed the company Intergraph, and they changed all the branding of everything. Anyway,
Hmm.
so that was my first exposure back in 1979. Was my first.
So I would say, would you say that was the your beginning of the courtship with Intergraph? That Would that all happen?
Yeah, well, here's what happened. I
Uh,
was working for DuPont,
uh,
and um, DuPont bought what became an Intergraph system, and they had in the company probably a dozen and a half workstations, right?
right.
And each workstation cost, I don't know, maybe it was $150,000, $200,000 for some of them. They had the fanciest ones you could buy. And if you pay $200,000 for a terminal, a workstation, they called it, and the computer it was connected to, which was a VAX, uh, it was that was $1 million, probably 1.5 million with
Yeah.
all the hardware. Anyway, you didn't let a schmuck little first year programmer, take over one of those workstations. They were allocated, 24 hours a day for production work. So I wrote some software so that I could view the drawings I was creating on a terminal, which was just a small little, um, you know, Tektronix type terminal. Does Tektronix still
Mhm.
exist?
No, no,
Huh?
but I had one of those too. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So there
Yeah.
used to be a terminal called a 4014,
Hmm.
which was, it was probably $5,000 worth of hardware, and I got somebody to buy one for me. And then
Hmm.
I wrote some software so that I could, see what I was doing. The software I was writing was converting P&ID drawings, and I wanted to be able to see if it worked. So
Right.
then, that
No, no, were you scanning in the drawings or were you
no,
reading the
no, this was
data?
the drawings were created by this internally developed system, Grid,
Okay.
and I was writing software to convert the data into the mostly just geometry
Hmm.
uh, on the Intergraph system. But I couldn't see whether it worked or not. And literally I had to go in the middle of the night to get one of these terminals so I could bring it up and say, oh, that didn't work. I'll try it again tomorrow.
Yeah.
And anyway, I wrote that software. And then a few other people at DuPont started using it, and I made it do, more and more stuff. I eventually made it so that you could actually even, draw with the Tektronix terminals, which were substantially cheaper than the Intergraph terminals. Of course, they were all connected to the Intergraph fax. So,
Yeah.
and then my brother Barry was a PhD student at Caltech in Pasadena, California,
Okay.
and he and his roommates had started a software company. But they were each three of them, each graduate students. So they created this software company in their spare time. The software company wrote software for chemistry. It was, for driving chemistry chromatography machines. Anyway, I knew nothing about it, but Barry
Yeah.
called me up and he said, hey, we need somebody full time, to A, run the business, but B, work on the software. And I understand, Keith, you know how to write software. So I said, oh, and I quit my job at DuPont and I moved to California. And while I was going, when I drove from Pennsylvania, Delaware actually, to California, I stopped in Huntsville, Alabama, where Intergraph was, and I showed them the software. I don't even know why I decided to do that because I didn't own it, of course. DuPont paid me to write it. So
Yeah.
I thought that perchance, Intergraph might be interested in doing something with the software, and maybe I could work out a deal with them where I, would help them with it. Anyway, it was
Who were you working with at Intergraph? Was Jim Medlock
yeah.
on the
Well, Jim
team?
was there. I didn't know
Okay.
him at the time, but I met with several people. One of whom was a fellow named John Mostert.
Hmm.
John was in charge of Intergraph Canada. Anyway, he was
Hmm.
a champion of innovation. So, I showed him the software that I had written for DuPont. It was owned by DuPont. I really, frankly, just had a tape and I showed it to them. And I said, hey, are you interested in? Then I drove, they said, we'll get back to you. And I drove to California and started working on chemistry software. And of course, I called Intergraph back and I said, you know, any interest? And they said, no, sorry. Of course, I don't blame them at all. This software enabled people to use a $5,000 terminal to
Sure.
replace, you
You'd be
know,
scavenging their expensive
and they were a
workstation.
hardware company. If you
Yeah.
know Jim Medlock, he was an electrical engineer and he loved hardware. And so the idea of selling software to allow people to not need, their expensive hardware
Mhm.
didn't sit well with them. And frankly, I don't blame them at all.
Yeah. At this
But we
point,
started, this
at this
company
point,
in,
so at this point, there was no software industry actually, right? I mean,
I don't think
not
so.
definitely
We're
not in
talking,
our industry.
no, this was 1981-ish.
Mhm. Yeah.
So there was a company called DEC, if you remember digital
Yeah.
equipment,
Sure.
and they were software and hardware. And I suppose there must have been some software companies, but it was previous to like Microsoft existing. It was before the personal computer and really I think before Apple. Autodesk didn't start till 1984 or 83 maybe. They were slightly ahead of Bentley Systems, but this is
Mhm.
81.
Okay.
I had only ever worked on, a VAX, and frankly, I think there was the beginnings of what became desktop computers. Because I remember IBM had something called an
Yeah.
IBM 9000 right around that time. Apple must have existed because
Yeah.
Barry's company was selling software for Apples.
Oh.
He started this company to sell software running on Apple computers. There were software companies at that time,
Mhm.
um, but you know, not many. So Barry and I uh, started working selling chemistry software, which
Hmm.
is a tough slog because the consumers of chemistry software are, research labs. They have no budget,
Hmm.
frankly.
Right.
And even
And
when
there's not that
they,
many of them either, right?
there's not that many of them. And, to use our software, you had to own a chromatography, setup, which was an expensive thing. And many labs didn't have it. Anyway, they didn't have budget for software, that's for sure. And even when they bought it, they didn't end up paying for it. So we lived hand to mouth, and it was really rough because software was hard to even explain to people. And so meanwhile,
Yeah.
I started thinking to myself, DuPont pays Intergraph, you know, add a zero on every invoice that we would send out. And I started, trying to explain to Barry that I thought the software I had written for DuPont could be made commercially available. And so I negotiated with my boss at DuPont, my ex-boss at DuPont, a deal wherein, because I wrote this software mainly from my own personal use, but
Mhm.
several other people at DuPont started using it. And when I left, there was nobody to enhance it or even to explain how to use it. So I made a deal. I would support DuPont's use of that software in exchange for the right to sell it. And of course, it didn't cost DuPont anything because it was just it wasn't part of my job to create this stuff, and they frankly didn't even have a clue, what how it worked. So I then got the ability to own the rights to the software that I created while I was employed by DuPont. And I convinced Barry that we should try to sell this. Now, at the time, the software ran only on an Intergraph system, right? All it
Right.
did was allow you to use a lower cost terminal connect to your Intergraph system. So the market for this was limited to people who owned Intergraph computers, Intergraph systems. But Intergraph was doing pretty well at the time. And they had this thing every year, they had a user conference. So I had gone to a user conference as a DuPont employee.
This was
And
iGug.
yes, I could.
Okay.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
Anyway, to every attendee, they gave a list of all the other attendees and their addresses. So I wrote a letter to every one of them. And I said, hey, I've got this software I created. Would you be interested? And then I made a questionnaire where I asked them, what they would do with it. And
Yeah.
then the last question I asked was, if this software existed and it worked and you were able to use it, how much would you pay for it? And it was amazing because we were selling chemistry software for $2,000, even $2,500 per
Uh-huh.
copy, right? And when I got these, it was amazing because I sent out, I don't know, I think it was a couple hundred, 400 or 500 of these surveys, just blind surveys, but
Right.
they were to the CAD manager. They were to whoever attended the iGug, right?
Yeah.
And I got like 48% of them back, which is
Wow.
unheard of. It was
Yeah.
an incredible response. And the answer to the question, the last question, how much would you pay? Averaged somewhere around $9,000.
My
So,
God.
yeah,
So this was your idea that this is where the idea went, light bulb went on, that you were actually going to make money doing.
we could
You could
make
ask,
a
you could name your
right.
price pretty much.
So, I mean, it's pretty rare to have an opportunity where, you start with a market, a captive market, and a product, right? And we
Mhm.
didn't raise any money. I started Bentley Systems.
Mhm.
I mean, I was working full time for this company, Dynamic Solutions, but I
Mhm.
started Bentley Systems in my spare time, and I just sent out copies of the program to people. We didn't even own a VAX. We didn't own anything from Intergraph, so we couldn't really. We used the Caltech VAX to write.
Uh-huh.
Barry and I, at night would sneak in and I literally, I'm not sure if it was sneaking in or not. Barry had an account, but it was a student account. Anyway, we
Yeah.
we uh, we started selling software as Bentley Systems, but I mean, Bentley Systems was just me in my spare time. I mean, I wasn't a full-time employee, but immediately we had a revenue stream that was by a factor of 3 or 4 greater than the Dynamic Solutions one was. And we took no external investment. So we were self-funded from the beginning, which is also, extremely rare.
Yeah.
Eventually then, I decided, look, I got to do this full time, and I quit Dynamic Solutions and I moved back from California to Philadelphia, where my brother Scott, I don't know if you ever met Scott.
I never met
He
Scott,
worked
no.
he worked at Bentley for its first like 10 or 12 years, and then he left and started his own company. But
Okay.
anyway, Scott
So
had
he's one of the five brothers.
he was one of the five, yes.
Okay.
At one
All right.
point there were 5 of us, but
Uh-huh.
Scott left relatively, well, I don't know, after 12 years or something, I think.
Okay.
We started in 84, and he must have left.
Yeah. So no daughters? That's just unusual.
No, there's 5 brothers and one daughter. She's the youngest. So my
Okay.
father, the story I was going, my mother says my dad wanted a girl and kept trying until he eventually got one, and then determined, hey, one's enough.
So she never
Anyway,
entered. She's the only one Bentley who never entered the business, correct?
right? Yes, she
Okay.
she's was a school teacher,
Okay.
uh, and had no interest at all in
Okay.
technology or computers. But yes, so there were
Okay.
5 brothers and one sister, but only the brothers ever worked for Bentley Systems. A lot of this is in that book I referred to. If what I say and what it says differ,
Yeah.
it's right, because I'm just trying to remember this stuff.
Okay. All right. Well, credit to you. You're going far back and remembering quite a
Yeah,
bit.
right. Well,
More than I
that was
could.
1984. We started Bentley Systems in 1984.
Okay.
I wrote the original software, which was called PseudoStation. We were doing very well selling software that ran on faxes at $9,000 a copy.
Right.
But it was pretty clear that, there's a couple of issues. One was the capabilities of a VAX. A VAX, they used to charge for a VAX 11780 or whatever the machine of the day was. It probably cost, I don't know, between $1 million and $2 million for all the hardware. And the capabilities of that VAX is far less than the phone you have in your pocket.
Hmm.
I mean, the, the, the compute capabilities were much less. It had far less memory, far less disk space, and we were kept connecting terminals to it.
Yeah.
So each one made it a little bit slower.
Hmm.
And, it worked pretty well, but not great. And
Yeah.
the personal computer started being, very capable. The biggest problem with the personal computer was there was no such thing as networks, so there was no way to get data onto them and off of them. The way most data got to the personal computers for CAD in the day
Mhm.
was using, RS-232, like a serial line, using a program called Kermit, if you remember way
Oh
back.
yeah.
So you
Mhm.
would Kermit your data back and forth, and it was usually at 1200 baud, maybe some people were able to get like 9600 baud, but
Yeah.
I mean that's quite slow. So getting data to and from the PC was the limiting factor at the beginning. And of course, there was very poor programming tools. So, software was hard to write and hard to test and hard to, and hard to distribute. The way we would distribute software was on floppies. And, floppies used to be 360K per floppy or something like that.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. We used to send you 20 of them. Anyway, so Bentley Systems began writing software for the VAX, but we pretty soon, like in 1986, we started in 84, and I think we
Yeah.
released the first version of what became MicroStation in like 86.
86. Okay.
Yeah, I think that's the
And
right time.
86 is when MicroStation first became a thing that was
Right,
introduced. Okay,
right.
got it.
Previous to
Okay.
that, we were only selling software that ran on VAXes, and you had to
Okay.
buy an Intergraph system. By the way, in 1986, there were probably 30 or 40 companies selling PC CAD, including Autodesk. They were there. They were
Hmm.
relatively early, but there was CAD everything at the time. It wasn't particularly unique to be selling CAD software for personal computers. We were
So
just
what was your, did you have it? were you just copying the field or were you making a distinction with MicroStation?
Our main distinction with MicroStation was the file format of MicroStation was compatible with the Intergraph system. And Intergraph is a very successful company. They one point right around that time, I think they had 10,000 employees and they were selling worldwide. And so there was a fairly well established market of people who were using Intergraph systems,
Mm,
pre-qualified themselves by being big companies to being able to afford an Intergraph system,
sure.
but they wanted to use the personal computer to kind of augment their, you know, their workflows.
Hmm.
And you could do that relatively easily if you were using MicroStation because the files, you could just transfer them from the PC to the VAX and vice versa. We made our file format exactly the same. So that was our biggest distinction. Well, and we also did some things that were relatively unique. One of the factors that I think Bentley Systems had relatively early on is Intergraph wrote lots of application software to run on their VAX, using their file format. So we recognized that to make MicroStation relevant for a lot of those things, we had to make it possible to write MicroStation applications. So we spent an inordinate amount of effort early on making an API for creating applications using MicroStation. Now, Autodesk had something called AutoLisp, and some of
Hmm.
the other vendors also were, able to create APIs, but we did it sort of as a first mission. We
Hmm.
said MicroStation should be a platform. And so, I think that's one of the hallmarks of Bentley Systems, even to today, is
Hmm.
we have always focused on writing software in layers, and the lower layers solve general problems, and you can use it for, a spectrum of things.
Hmm.
The
Hmm.
MicroStation was, I think, better at that than most of the other ones that died,
Now,
at
you,
the
you
same time.
mentioned the PC and it was just coming around, but was the thought in your head still that you were going to support multiple systems like Apple's and
Well,
Intergraph?
we yes, we
Yeah.
originally did the DOS, right? That was IBM DOS. But the Macintosh, when it came out, it was relatively successful.
Mhm.
And so I think the Mac may have been our second platform, which was a real problem because trying to make software that runs both on DOS and on the Mac, they were, very different beasts. And so we put a lot of work into that. Then Unix came along, and, there were Unix vendors. People sold workstations like Silicon Graphics, if you remember them. And,
Hmm.
well, HP had a workspace station, and Intergraph made a workstation. And they were
Hmm.
all run on different flavors of Unix. This is before Linux existed. So there was HPUX and, Iris, and, there was all kinds of flavors of Unix. So at one point we supported 12 different platforms. And
Wow.
every time we had a release, we had to test it 12 different ways. And it was really, really hard.
Yeah. Oh, imagine there's not enough developers to
Right.
take care of all that, not enough testers.
So,
It's
we had
enormous.
12 different platforms, but there were
Mm-hmm.
three flavors. There was
Mm-hmm.
the Unix flavor,
Mm-hmm.
which, they all differed a little bit, but
Yeah.
Unix was relatively known. And, Unix had virtual memory. So that was a big advantage.
Right.
DOS did not. We had to run in 640K in our DOS version. The
Yeah.
Mac had some crazy memory management scheme, but it wasn't really virtualized memory.
Uh,
So we had three different memory management techniques. It was awful.
yeah.
And what happened was we had to put as much work into each of the three separate types of computers,
Mm-hmm.
three operating systems, really. But we
Uh,
only made money on one. Windows came out, and
yeah.
Windows became, 97% of our revenue. But, the Mac and Unix were
Yeah.
each as much of cost as much, but made us virtual. And so eventually we abandon all of the versions of MicroStation other than Windows.
Yeah, but you're jumping ahead to
Yeah,
2000,
that was probably
1995
nine.
yeah,
Yeah, right.
yeah. Wow, that took a
Anyway,
long time.
the early days of Bentley were, the hardware was really, you know, hard to configure, and networks didn't exist, so getting software around between developers was hard. Anyway,
Mhm.
we put a lot of work at the time into just the plumbing, but today is basically free. Like if you were to try to write software today, you wouldn't worry about okay, source code management and anyway, we we had to do all of that ourselves. We had to invent it. We and everyone
Right.
else. I mean,
Yeah,
we
yeah,
had no disadvantage, but no advantage over the other 30 companies that were each trying to mine the same,
right, right.
opportunity.
When Weisberg describes the situation at the time, the environment, he says Apple didn't pursue them, didn't market it well enough, and that was one of the reasons a better
Well,
product
yeah,
may not have gotten its fair share.
right. Yeah. We used to go and visit with Apple,
Mhm.
fairly regularly. And you're right, they never paid much attention to you know, the hard engineering type problems because
Mhm.
they were more focused on artists and, well, the
The
Mac was
creatives.
creative,
Yeah, yeah,
and they were doing fine. So they didn't. I wouldn't claim that I think they made a mistake, but they certainly weren't very helpful.
yeah,
So, and nor was Microsoft, by the way. Microsoft gave us no help almost. They frankly didn't know the CAD world existed because they were printing money. Windows was
yeah,
being used for every business opportunity. So engineering wasn't a focus for them either at the time. But the Mac really did. It had a couple of problems, technical problems, but it really had no momentum. So
mhm.
we never managed. We never made any money on it, at least
Yeah,
on the
yeah,
original
right,
Mac.
right. I want to go back a little bit to Intergraph because from the beginning to almost the beginning to the period we're talking about now, Intergraph was still very much a partner to Bentley Systems, right?
Well, right. So partner, uh,
Okay. So I want to interrupt this my own thought with something else. Are you a married man, Keith?
I am
How long have you been married?
39 years.
Okay. Well, nobody cares with a happy marriage. Nobody cares about a happy marriage until, but perish the thought, there's a divorce, then
Right.
everybody wants to
Yeah,
know what
everybody
happened,
will
right?
know your
So
business, right?
a little
Well,
bit of a parallel here. Did that,
right. Our early relationship was with Intergraph. We were creating the software,
right,
selling it as being compatible with their system,
right,
right? But we were basically competing with them. And, Jim Malik was a very smart guy. And he said, the better they do, the worse I do, at least in terms of hardware. He was
right,
trying to sell hardware. Then they had the bright idea of creating their own workstation. And they kind of then said, hey, maybe if MicroStation ran on our workstation,
mhm,
we could make money selling the hardware and the software together.
yeah.
And
Was this the Clipper? Do you remember?
yes, that was the
Okay,
earliest one they had was
okay,
a Clipper,
yeah,
right?
uh,
Uh, they bought the chip from Fairchild, a company that was a real computing company previous to the PC.
mhm,
PCs just killed Fairchild, and Intergraph ended
yeah,
up buying the technology from them. But anyway, the Clipper was their computer. And so, there was another company, frankly, that whose mission was to create Intergraph compatible files. Well, I mean, that idea wasn't particularly novel, and another
mhm,
company tried it. And Intergraph bought exactly 50% of that company. So for a time, we were competing not only with Intergraph on their hardware, but with this Intergraph selling this other company's PC software. But frankly, it was pretty poor. It didn't work particularly well. So we were winning quite handily, competing with Intergraph. And then, you know, Jim Madlock said, "Hey, enough. and he called us and said, "Hey, why don't you guys come talk to us?" And we ended up making a deal where we sold Intergraph exactly 50.0% of Bentley Systems. It was a terrible deal in retrospect. Seemed like a great idea at the time. Because of course we were always worried Intergraph was going to sue us, or and they were always bad mouthing us to their
Cheap.
customers. This was going to
It's
be
like the 50, it's like marriage, 50-50. What could go
right.
wrong?
Exactly. Well, the dumbest thing ever was 50.0% equity and board of directors with two from each side. So
Uh,
deadlocks built in, right?
yeah, yeah,
And anyway, they started selling in exchange for they're acquiring 50% of our company. We gave Intergraph the exclusive right to sell MicroStation, which we thought at the time was great because we weren't, we were programmers. There was 12 of us, right? We didn't have
there was
time.
no, you didn't have to have sales or marketing. You just
Right.
depend on
So,
them.
Intergraph took over both sales, marketing, and support.
Yeah,
So we just focused on software, on writing software,
yeah.
and it worked great. The
Until it
problem
didn't.
was,
Okay, you were deadlocked. You mentioned that, but I've got to think based on what you said and what I read, Intergraph was still very much a hardware company. They're just discovering the software was going to, they hadn't
well,
quite come to that realization yet. So
exactly.
they were
So
not going
Intergraph
to,
had two products of
okay,
ours that they could
okay,
sell. One was our PC product, which
okay.
competed directly with AutoCAD, right? It was
Mhm,
substitutable and priced almost exactly the same.
yeah.
Then they had their own workstation and a version of MicroStation that ran on their workstation. And of course, they incented all their salespeople, based on the hardware sale. If you're a salesperson, would you rather make a $25,000 sale where you get commissioned, double, or a, $3,000 hardware or software sale? So their salespeople had our exclusive right to distribute were predisposed to talk our own software down. And they tried to sell, they would, instead of selling 5 copies of MicroStation, they'd sell one with a workstation for the same number of dollars. So, it wasn't a great plan for us. Meanwhile, Autodesk was doing great. And Autodesk, frankly, kicked our ass many ways. But one of the things they did really well is they gave copies of AutoCAD to educational institutes, universities. They gave it to them for free. And Jim Medlock, the CEO of Intergraph, was convinced that software was a bad idea. So he didn't want to give it to anybody. So
Mhm.
MicroStation was never used in educational institutes. People graduating from college at the time said putting CAD on their resume. CAD meant AutoCAD. Meanwhile, we were doing relatively well, but Intergraph started recognizing the fact, and Intergraph, by the way, took all that. Remember, I was describing all of their applications that they had written to run on their fax-based systems. They converted them all to run on MicroStation, mostly on their workstations, but even some of them ran on the PC. So MicroStation started becoming, and Intergraph was $1 billion a year company. They're a serious company,
Yeah.
but they were becoming more and more dependent on this software that they only owned 50% of. Right? They owned 50% of Bentley Systems, but a very large percentage of their revenue was dependent on MicroStation for its existence. So eventually, Intergraph became a little unhappy with their lack of control,
Mhm.
and they came to us and said, "Hey, we're going to create something to compete with MicroStation." And in our contract, because we had a very smart lawyer at the time named David Nation,
Mhm.
uh, we had the ability, if Intergraph competed, because they had the exclusive distribution rights, but
Uh-huh.
if they decided to compete with Bentley Systems, then we got to appoint a third director, and the distribution became non-exclusive. They could still sell it.
Ah, so
So
that was your little loophole, if I can call it
right,
that, right?
right, right.
So this is why they were not inviting the Bentley brothers, any of them, to the meetings in which Jupiter was conceived, correct?
Exactly. I'm now referring to Jupiter. That was
Okay.
they came up to us and they sent this crew of programmers and our friends, because we had been working with them for a long time,
Mm,
to tell us about Jupiter.
mm,
And it was mainly meant to scare us.
mm,
And, I frankly thought, hey, what's the way out of this 50-50 relationship? Make us an offer, right? They could buy
mm.
the other half of Bentley Systems, and for the right number, which would have been, you know, pennies compared to what they ended up spending.
Yeah.
But they never, ever made us an offer. And in fact, they tried to scare us and say, hey, you guys are not going to make any money because we're just going to replace you with this Jupiter thing. And I said, be gone. All right. We're not scared. And we knew that we would have the ability to sell our own software if they did that. So I basically decided it was a good thing. But anyway,
My fa
that's the whole
my
thing.
favorite part of that history was this is a quote attributed to you. If you think that offer is fair, why don't you sell us your 50% for that
Right,
price?
right. I did. And, they did make us a ridiculous offer.
Uh,
And I said, hey, if that's your number,
uh,
we'll write you a check. Give us our half back. It'll be great.
uh,
Anyway, they were not interested in that either. And then that was the beginning of what many people call the messy divorce.
uh,
Because, if you were using MicroStation, you bought it from Intergraph, right?
right,
You thought Intergraph was the universe, but you didn't even know
sure,
Bentley Systems existed.
right.
Then you started getting letters from this company called Bentley Systems that said, hey, that software you're using? We wrote it, and we're going to start, working on versions of it that are going to be, different and not from Intergraph. Meanwhile, Intergraph is telling them, hey, that MicroStation, you don't need it anymore because we're going to replace it with this great thing called Jupiter, which I don't even know that they ever actually released it.
Mm,
Uh,
mm,
so the divorce got ugly, and people started, wondering that. I think a lot of people thought, oh, we're going to have to pick a side. But in reality, there was no option to continue using MicroStation or anything like MicroStation. Using something on the PC, because Intergraph really never created any solutions that you could use. But
mm,
then eventually lawsuits ensued, and Dave's got the if you go on to Dave, he probably knows all the facts. But
yeah.
eventually we settled the lawsuits, and we started hiring a bunch of people from Intergraph with their permission
Mm,
to
mm,
to create Bentley Systems. Uh, and eventually we did buy all their shares back.
yeah.
So
You did at
yeah,
a
yes.
probably at a much greater price than
It
initially.
was, yes, of course. So their number kept going up. And of course,
Yeah,
at that time, Intergraph started doing very poorly, right? I
yeah.
mean, they
Ah,
were
okay.
harder
So
to. So,
they became a good deal where you were probably priced too
well,
high.
then they went private, right? And
Mm.
and a private equity firm took Intergraph private, and we actually bought the shares back from them.
What they ended up doing was nothing as grand as MicroStation, but they ended up with making that office made Imagineer and then
Yeah.
eventually led to Solid Edge, actually, right?
Yes. Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. Well, Solid Edge now is owned by
Siemens.
Siemens, right?
Yeah, yeah.
So,
Right,
I mean, it wasn't that they didn't do anything, but Solid Edge didn't compete with MicroStation at all. MicroStation, by the
right,
time that
right,
happened, we were completely out of the mechanical world. So
right.
Solid Edge wasn't an issue. No MicroStation users.
Bentley did make a foray into the mechanical world,
We
right? You
did. We
actually
had
had a
something called
space
MicroStation Modeler, right?
modeler. Yes,
Right.
yes, yes. At
But we
Aces and
quickly
everything.
determined that you couldn't use the same platform for doing small parts and also doing large plants, right? The
Mm,
concepts were different, the scale of the data is different. So we just decided to focus on AC and infrastructure. And
mm,
eventually we started to realize that, look, if our software is relevant, it's got to be for something that is large enough that it has a location on the earth, right? So when you're designing parts for manufacturing, there's no such thing as a location. But anyway, GIS became really important, and earth-based context became important. So our platform kind of evolved in that direction and away from what Solid Edge and all of the mechanical universe. They worry about problems that we don't, and
mm,
don't worry about
mm.
problems that we do.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
But basically, it was us and Bentley and Autodesk really started focusing on that. A few others, but that's what we. But now, now Autodesk also had a second platform that they created, inventor.
It goes on.
Then we started all of our events.
I'd be so happy if you could come back.
I'm just one of very many. I mean, the story of who did what at Bentley Systems is way more than the Bentleys. But I mean, Greg would know better about many other things.
I'd like to have him on as a guest too, because
I hope he will.
his background. He went up from EE to software development. He went from a finance
Right.
to this. Just
Greg
even,
tries to claim he's a financial engineer.
okay.
Nobody buys it, but he still claims that. Greg learned everything faster than anybody. Greg sold his company that wrote software, and was unemployed.
Yeah.
I mean, he had plenty of money, so he didn't have to work. But then he decided, hey, you know what? Maybe I should join Bentley Systems. And we said, Greg, he came to one of our user conferences, and he met everybody. He talked to every single attendee. I don't know if that's literally true, but pretty close to true.
Yeah. And remembered them, right?
Yes. And then after that meeting, he knew more about our users and our industry than anybody at Bentley Systems. He didn't even work for us yet.
Well, you were a wise man to bring him in, I gotta say.
Well,
Because
it wasn't a plan. He just, ended up unemployed to do something, and there was this company with his name on it.
Hey, you go down to your workshop. Be careful in there, okay?
Yeah, right. Oh, next time I'll show you some of my work.
Let me see all 10 fingers.
I still have all of them.
All right, knock on wood.
All right, see you.
All right, Keith, this has been great. I will talk to you again soon, I hope. All right.
Yep.
All right. Bye-bye. This concludes this episode of the History of CAD podcast. Please join me in our next episode as we add to the rich history of design software. If you'd like to be a guest on the show or know someone who has stories to share, please let me know via email at rupinder@edgetechnica.com. Companies can sponsor an episode of the History of CAD. Get the details on our website, edgetechnica.com/sponsorship.